bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 73 of Society and the State. Connor Boyack here alongside Brian Hyde to talk about something that's been on my mind for a while. Many of our listeners may not even know that until actually recently, Brian, you were on our team here at Libertas Institute doing some fundraising and networking. And as I've had to do this for the past few years, as I've helped on political campaigns, trying to get liberty-minded candidates elected, it's been really interesting to see and ponder if there's actually market demand for freedom, for the fight, for the effort, for the cause. And it's really interesting because you always have, your core few people who will open up their checkbook, who will donate. But as the founder of now two nonprofits, having to fundraise every single day, trying to, please the will of potential donors and try and get them to support what we're doing, it leads me to ponder if we had to somehow subject ourselves to the free market, if rather than finding a few people who could donate a lot, if we had to say, look, all these people who on Facebook or whatever say, yeah, I love what you guys are doing, if we were at their mercy to actually financially support what we were doing to make it possible, I think we'd have to close our doors within weeks.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the obvious question. Why do you think that is? Is it human nature? People just want to follow the path of least resistance, or? Well,
I know I'm not alone in this, right? So talking with other think tanks, other activist groups, talking certainly to political candidates, the idea for this episode was prompted in part because of a discussion on this issue I had with a very like-minded candidate who was struggling. They're like, hey, where are my friends, and where's the support, and what's going on? And so I know this is not something that just our organization struggles with. And so your question, I think, is a fair one that we ponder often. Why does this happen? And I don't know. I mean, I have a few theories. And Brian, I want to get your take. I mean, certainly you were here in the trenches, trying to eke out whatever small amount of money we could from people who claim to support, the final result of all these things that we were doing. I think one of the problems is more kind of this human nature issue of apathy. When you feel comfortable, you don't have that sense of urgency. Here's a more specific example. So our listeners know that here at Libertas Institute, we're based in Utah. And obviously for this podcast, it's not a Utah-centric thing, but our organization focuses on Utah issues. And there are think tanks like ours in other states, and basically every other state, I think, except for North Dakota, with, different strategies and success and focuses or whatnot. But I'm talking about like a right-of-center, libertarian, conservative, free market type of organization, okay? What's interesting to me is looking at the size and the budget size, the personnel size, the budget size of organizations in different states, organizations like ours. And if you look at red states, blue states, you look at heavily, liberal-dominated states versus conservative states, my impression, I haven't crunched the numbers, but looking around at all these different organizations, it seems to me that the organizations in the free market type organizations in very Democrat-heavy controlled states are bigger, they have better operations, they have much larger donations. And my theory there is that in those states, the conservative, libertarian-minded individuals, business owners and so forth, philanthropists, they feel the pain. It's very present for them, and it's very there's a sense of urgency. Whereas take a state like Utah, here we're this libertarian-leaning organization in one of the most conservative states in the union, and you go out to these like-minded people, and their perception at least is that but we have limited government and low taxes and low regulation.
All is well.
All is well, right? No worries. I'm going to go back to sleep and go focus on my business and my family. I think that's what's going on here is the sense of apathy from a misunderstanding about how serious the problem is. These so-called red states, Tom Woods is fond of talking about the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. Another tool for describing this is the Overton window, the spectrum of allowable ideas that society considers mainstream. And I think you see that too where in conservative states, people see the spectrum like, well, we fit within there, like things are great, we're conservatives, so I don't need to worry about it now. I think the problem and our struggle is to help these people realize that even in red states, we're not being graded on a curve. That's not how liberty is. Oh, we're less tyrannical than everybody else. Yes.
We're the healthiest patient in the cancer ward.
Mission accomplished, right? And so we're not graded on a curve, and yet many people feel that we are, because that's how the conversation is. That's what the 3x5 card says. That's what the Overton window says. Oh, look, we're a little more to the right than everybody else. And the problem is, from our perspective, of course, from those who believe in liberty, that narrow range is far off from this ideal that we're trying to strive to. And so it's almost like there is no market. That's obviously needs to be qualified. There is little market demand for freedom because of this perception that we're doing all right, and that we're not so far off the mark.
So it comes down to a difference in motivation then in those states where they do have very active donor bases. More than likely, the motivation is because they are seeing right in front of them tangible proof day after day that there is opposition to their liberty, or that it's in threat, or it's in danger. Where I agree with your assessment, though. In a red state like Utah, particularly, we're pretty nonchalant about it because of that reputation. I mean, come on, Mitt Romney moved here so that he could run for Senate. How much more evidence do you need?
I think the term is stroll into the Senate seat, not run for Senate.
Yes, he was actually kind of wheeled there by a throng of supporters. But the bottom line is there are a lot of people in this state who haven't looked at the nuts and bolts. So they're very good at enjoying the superficial appearances, but they haven't really crunched the numbers or looked at the nuts and bolts. I know that this is something that you do through Libertas, not just during the legislative session, but every day, throughout the year. You guys are reading the fine print. You're examining the principles that are at stake. And if more people were willing to be fine print readers, I think you would see more motivated people willing to step up and go, no, we do have a problem here.
And the thing that we've run into, Brian, that you may be able to relate to is so often people will not engage until they are impacted, until they recognize, I should say, that they're impacted, because they're impacted anyways. Slowly the pot of boiling water, right, and the frog is acclimatized to it or whatever. But if you spike that heat, whoa, all of a sudden I can tell that there's a problem here. I've had occasion to speak with some donors who are new donors who only really, quote, woke up or were awoken to the sense of this awful situation, this problem that we're facing after a very direct experience to themselves or someone they love. I remember speaking with one donor, a very well-off person, and, the type of person who can make any problem go away. Just sign a check and, hey, my lawyers will deal with it or whatever, right? Not a person who's very troubled by, the rough and tumble of the world around us. And I believe it was his daughter, may have been a daughter-in-law, was investigated by DCFS, the Child Services Agency, on a very specious reason, dragged her through the mud, caused all these problems. She was innocent. Threatening separating her from her kids, all this kind of stuff. It was a very real and raw wake up for him to feel vulnerable and to feel the raw power and the weight of the government to disrupt your family, to violate your freedoms. And so he wrote a check, because he was impacted. He finally got it. And it seems like much of our work becomes helping people see that, look, even if you don't feel the heat spiking, it's rising, and it's killing these other people. It's harming these other people. Look around you. And it almost requires this empathy, because if people aren't personally impacted, we have to move them. We have to give them cause to part with their hard-earned money to support the cause, to do something larger than themselves. But it almost requires making an emotional connection with them to say, you need to understand, look at Bob, look at Sally, look at these other people. Maybe you're doing all right, but these other people aren't, and you're in a capacity to do something about it. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, it helps to have skin in the fight. That's obviously people who've been impacted see it from a perspective that those who haven't yet been impacted can't. There's something else, though, at play here. And as you were telling about this, I was reminded of the quote from Harriet Tubman, who helped slaves escape from slave states to free states through the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. And she talked about how I freed hundreds of slaves. I could have freed thousands of slaves if I could only have convinced them that they were slaves.
Wow.
And that, let that sink in for a moment. What was the difference between the ones who chose to stay where they were because they didn't really believe they were slaves, and the ones who said, you're right, I need to get out of here? It was moral clarity. And folks who've been on the receiving end of, here, have some government, they will have a moral clarity that folks who haven't may not have. So I think part of the job that is before us and everyone else who wants to raise awareness and help perpetuate liberty is, how do we create that moral clarity in people, even the ones who aren't currently feeling the heat?
And I think where we're talking about, is there a market demand for freedom? You ask Tubman, right? Was there a market demand for liberating slaves, right? And she would say, well, yeah, there are a ton of slaves, but maybe within the mentality wasn't quite there to really, have a broader impact. Obviously, there are many people in the fight for freedom today. It's not like nothing's happening, but it could be a lot more. And we would say from a moral position, it should be a lot more. And yet these people don't realize the awful threat, the many problems, the loss of our liberty. And I come away from this with the feeling that it all boils down to awareness and urgency. We need to help people understand that things are there are problems. There are problems that they can help influence and solve. But the issue has been, I think, that in past decades, or for many people throughout their entire life, the status quo and the direction of the directional attitude towards our freedoms has been consistent. They're acclimatized to it. The boiling water is going by 0.1 degrees every few weeks, and no big deal, right? I'm getting used to it. We have to figure out a way to snap people out of port, help them recognize the temperature is rising. That's where I think that the problem comes down to, is getting people to snap out of it. You look at those blue states, and they feel that urgency. They recognize that someone else is controlling that temperature knob. I think about here in our own state, of very conservative Utah. You look at the more leftist type of groups, the Planned Parenthood folks, the LGBT. These folks rally and they organize and they mobilize and they donate, right? And maybe they're not as successful as they would like to be in a very red state, but they feel the pain on their side from their perception of, well, I don't like this and it's horrible and our, my right to kill my baby is being violated, so let's now rally. But from their perspective, that's a problem, so they're going to mobilize and raise funds. And those of us in the freedom side, I think we're so used to our situation. We're so used to losing, and maybe many of us on the 4th of July, we feel, oh, we have freedom, everything is great. And so we don't have that sense of urgency. There's a lot of apathy. We need to find ways, if we're going to kind of instigate or cultivate that market demand for freedom, I think we have to figure out a way to get people to snap out of their status quo.
Okay, I'm going to throw an idea out there. Feel free to shoot it down, but I can't help but wonder if one of the reasons why the left is so effective at mobilizing active people to participate is because they're a little bit better at empathy. I'm just, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but generally, a lot of times those left causes have some basis in, we are standing up for somebody who either can't stand up for themselves or hasn't been able to, or hasn't stood up for themselves. So they're doing it for the other guy. It's not a matter of it's happening to me. It's a matter of, look, this is happening to somebody else, and I find that intolerable. My perception is that's a little bit harder attitude sometimes to find on the right. And we can draw some distinctions here. Taken too far, that becomes, the encouragement of victim mentality, because then you have constituencies. Well, look, you're a victim. I'm here to save you. Right. Depend on me. Don't ever depend on yourself. And that's a bad thing, taken to that end. On the other extreme, though, you have, hey, I'm in it for me. The rest of you are on your own. Right. Which could lead a person to complacency in that, you know what, my situation's not bad. There's plenty of good things on TV. I've got cold beer in the fridge. I'm comfortable. Why would I step out of that comfort zone?
I'm glad you brought this up, because I think there's another layer here, and that is the emotional response that different strategies produce. When we stand up and say, well, the Founding Fathers said we need to maintain the Second Amendment to preserve our rights. Okay, sure. Everyone who's read, Thomas Jefferson's collected works is going to nod their heads and say, yeah, I agree with you.
He did say that.
But the broader public doesn't care, doesn't get it, doesn't understand. You need to speak in a language that they understand. And when we on the right get very philosophical or very, abstract and talk at a high level about our rights and their historical importance and everything else, we're not speaking a language that, unfortunately, thank you, public school, that the public really understands. And so rather than talking about the Second Amendment in Founding Fathers terms, I would consider it much more effective to point to a story, a specific person, let's say a single mother. These stories are out there, elevating them, in fact, getting these people involved, making them the face of this issue to say, look, this single mom, her home was invaded in, Chicago, and she was about to be sexually abused and perhaps killed by these two intruders. But she had a gun, and so when these guys broke down her door, there was equalization in terms of the hostility, the threat. She was able to deter the threat using her firearm. She preserved her chastity. She saved her life, saved her kid's life. I think you need to point to a very specific example of a real story and make it a human issue. Let me offer this example, Brian, because what you said really resonates with me. When the LGBT movement did precisely what you just said, right? They were able to put a face to it. They were able to present that victim status to great success, to encourage sympathy and support and really change the national debate on gay marriage. We were looking at that. We said, okay, they're on to something. Agree or disagree with the policy, look at the power of this emotional resonance, this story that captivates people. When you humanize the problem, think about war. You have to dehumanize the other, right? It's okay that we're attacking Syria and Yemen and everywhere else with bombs because it's those jihadists, those terrorists. It's always this aggregate group of faceless people that we can't relate to. But when you see a little girl whose head has been exploded, by a bomb, and you see her father weeping over her, that's really hard to get over. That's really hard to maintain your, flag-waving imperialistic attitudes, right? So the humanization element is crucial if we're to have the proper relations in society between one another. And so we look at the LGBT and we say, they did that, and look what it did. Agree or disagree, but they used it. It worked. So, okay, let's take something like medical cannabis in a red state like Utah. Oh, we'll be one of the last ones to do it, right? There's such an anti-drug attitude. And yet, in fact, Brian, you can see the shirt I'm wearing.
Yep, Utah Patients Coalition.
Right. So we are on the cusp of getting certified on the ballot in Utah. The polling went from the 40s and 50s up to the high 70 percentile over the past few years. Why? Because we have been sharing stories. We have been humanizing the issue. We have been letting everyone know, that aunt that has cancer, that nephew of yours who has epilepsy, your brother-in-law who's a veteran with PTSD, all of these people can be helped. Look in other states. They are being helped. And the emotional connection that these people have with their family, their friends, their coworkers, we borrow that. We leverage that emotional connection and bring it over to the issue to say, this is why it's important. It's not important in the abstract. It's not important because Thomas Jefferson said so. It's not important because we read it in a book. It's important because this matters to your family. This matters to you on a very personal level.
I've seen it happen. Years ago, I was doing a show down in southern Utah, and we got talking about illegal immigration, which is a hot-button issue anywhere you go. And I had a young man join me in the studio who was in America illegally. I think he was 20 years old. He had come over from Mexico with his parents when he was very, very young. I mean, he speaks perfect English. He's lived in America since he was, I think, 8 years old. Hard worker, wants to get his citizenship. But, I put him on the air with me just to do exactly what you're talking about. This is a person. This is not an insect, who crossed the border to make your life miserable.
He's not invading.
And it was so interesting, some of the reactions, because people called up and got angry. How dare you try to put this sob story together? And we weren't, trying to pull heartstrings. Just asking this kid about him. Tell me about your life. What brought your parents here? Why do you stay?
Yeah.
Why don't you go back? And it really infuriated some people because suddenly there was a human face instead of this abstract illegal here taking our jobs and taking our welfare benefits.
Yeah.
Which this kid had done none of those things.
That's so interesting. I think we have to translate this though to the average Joe. Let's use me as an example. I'm running this organization. We have to raise over $1 million a year to, pay the bills, pay everybody, and so on and so forth. Okay, so $1 million, right? That's our target. That's a ton of money. That is hard to raise $1 million. I used to be a web developer. I never thought I'd be raising $1 million. That's just crazy, right? But that's what we need. That's what our cause requires, and that's what's translated in our case into profound success. Okay, so there's our target. I got to figure out how to get people to part with a substantial sum of money. And so I look at that and I say, look, there's no market demand. Maybe I can find some very wealthier people for whom writing a larger check is not that big of a deal. But I'll tell you, and Brian, you know this experience, It's as easy to get a wealthier person to part with a $10,000 check as it is for an average family to donate $10 a month. It's very hard to get your average person who agrees with you. They'll like everything on Facebook, they'll comment, they'll interact, but then when you ask them to donate, it becomes much harder. And I think, going back to our theorizing here in our discussion, I think a lot of that stems from there's no sense of urgency. They don't have that emotional connection where they can see that their investment, big or small, is going to translate into tangible results. Let me shift the conversation this way. Think nationally. We've been talking at a state level, Utah or elsewhere, right? Think at a national level. There's some serious problems. These are big problems, and there are organizations who are trying to do something about it. But I think that people have had people, I should say, who are like-minded with us, have a bit of fatigue and disenchantment with the prospect of success. They look at, the Cato Institute. Okay, I have many friends that work at the Cato Institute. They do a lot of great work. But from a donor perspective, let's say you're sent something in the mail and they're asking you to donate $100. You look at that and you say, okay, well, the Cato Institute has been around for a few decades now. What have they accomplished? Like, what laws have changed as a result? They've educated a bunch of people. They've been part of the conversation. That is also important. I'm not trying to knock Cato Institute or anybody else. But from a donor perspective, I think people are trained to think in terms of ROI, return on investment.
Sure. Okay,
I'm going to donate this $100. What's it going to do? I don't want to, pay for some birthday party at the office. I don't want to, have it go to waste. I want to know what's the result going to be. And at a national level, I think there's such disenchantment, rightly so, about our prospect of really shifting things, changing the law, protecting our freedom, that there's been a bit of disengagement from like-minded people that even though I think there's urgency, people are really upset about the NSA and the wars and the income tax and regulations and everything else. But I think we've been so defeated for so many times that people, even though they feel the burden, they feel the urgency, they haven't yet seen a path forward for victory. They haven't been told, here's how we're going to succeed. They see all around us these like-minded organizations, not just Cato, there are many others, who, if they have any victories at all, maybe they're very small and seldom. And I think that's tough because then we go to them maybe at a state level or a local level and we say, hey, we have an action plan, we have a track record of success, and here's what we're going to do. But we're so infected by this national conversation. Most people's attention, as you know, are at the national level, the national issues. It becomes hard to get them to walk away from that years of ingrained fatigue and disenchantment to see a path forward for victory where they're going to say, yes, I'm going to invest. This is going to be awesome. So I think that's tough. And I think maybe it's still going back to the emotional thing that we have to tie together. But I think to your first question, Brian, I guess I'd say yes. I think this is a human nature problem that we're having to work up against.
In my observation, the people who are willing to open their checkbooks, the ones who are willing to step out of their comfort zone, donate time, which is also very valuable, are the people who have found some sense of purpose in doing so. And so I guess that's kind of the bridge we have to gap there is how do we help people find common purpose with that? I know, having been working in fundraising, part of what fundraisers do is they give meaning and purpose to people's donations. So when someone, cuts a check to you, they know that the influence they wish to exert is being done through your organization.
Yeah.
So whatever it takes to create that purpose, maybe that's something we should talk about another time.
And you'll remember this little quote, Brian, that involvement, I think I'm getting this right, involvement precedes investment. Before someone is going to financially support a cause, it's more likely that they're going to be involved somehow. Maybe it means that they're affected by it, and that's their involvement. It's involuntary involvement where they are affected by it, so then they're like, here, go fight this, here's some money. Or, perhaps they're a volunteer, or perhaps they're consulting or giving advice or offering some sort of input, right? Dear listener, let's ask you, right? Like, you believe in these ideas, you support this. Ask yourself, have a moment of introspection. What has been your level of commitment to the cause you care about? Are there organizations out there in your state, in your country, in your community who are trying to fight for the ideals that you espouse? I will tell you, from the perspective of a founder of 2 nonprofits, it is very hard trying to find the people who support what we do and who are willing to actually materially support it, where a lot of people have their 9-to-5 jobs, they have their families, they have their church and everything else that they're involved in. The parting of money, the investment, the financial contribution is a way for them to participate without having to do so on a time basis. It's a signal to say, I support what you're doing. I can't be involved right now. I don't have the time, but I do want to invest. I want you to know that there are my contributions. This is my my investment in the cause. So consider that for a moment for yourself. There are so many good organizations out there, and where our question today is there a market demand for freedom? Gosh, I hope so, right? Because it's too important to not have demand. We've got to do this anyways, whether our supporters are materially investing in the cause or not. But it is a challenge for those of us leading these organizations. So if you believe in these ideas, please find an organization that you support and invest. Maybe it's your time, maybe it's your money, even if it's a little bit. Those little bits are signals to the people involved in the trenches. I'll tell you, it is such a motivation to see even the Jesus proverbial widow's mite. We have a couple donors who I know are not well off by any means, and their contributions speak to our hearts as a signal that, what you guys are doing is important. I don't have a lot to give, but this much I am going to give.
And they do it consistently.
Yeah, I mean, that's powerful. So it doesn't matter the amount. It's the signal, right? This is the market signal indicating demand. It's people out there saying, keep it up, good job, here's a little fuel to the fire. So I don't know, a few reflections for you guys today, something to ponder. Is there a market demand for freedom? If not, how can we increase that demand? Talk to your friends. Let's get more people involved in actually moving this cause forward and put our shoulder to the wheel, because there's a great work to do. All right, guys, that wraps up episode 73 of Society and the State. Next time, this is a fun conversation. We're going to talk about why governments need competition. Tantalizing discussion. You won't want to miss it. Stick around. Make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.